Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. It's been a while since I've been your host. I am joined today, as usual, by your more frequent lately hosts, Don Watkins and Stefan Hanna. Hey, guys.
Hey, Alex.
Hey, Alex.
So, I've looked at the stories you guys have prepared, including there's one that involves me, and I have some thoughts on them, and I'm really eager to get started. So, Don, why don't we do your first story?
The Washington Post has a fascinating and frankly chilling article where it's drawing attention to something that I have not seen reported in the so-called mainstream media, which is that environmentalist ideas have made an appearance in two of the recent mass murder manifestos, the Christchurch murder of New Zealand and the El Paso gunman. And the article's called Two Mass Killings, A World Apart Share a Common Theme, Eco-Fascism. And this is by Joel Achenbach. And according to the Post, the alleged Christchurch shooter declared himself explicitly an eco-fascist and railed about immigrants' birth rates. And in the El Paso shooter's statement, he bemoans water pollution, plastic waste, and an American consumer culture that is, quote, creating a massive burden for future generations. And the Post goes on to note some various aspects of environmentalism that can feed mass murders and that have been endorsed explicitly by larger groups of white nationalists. For example, it talks about environmentalist apocalypticism and overpopulation catastrophism, and how these can be extremely appealing as rationalizations for mass murder. So the Post says, quote, conservationists have a long history of wrestling with questions about immigration and population growth. Some of those on the environmental left have seen the explosion in human population as a primary driver of the environmental crisis. This argument has been adopted by racists. And it goes on to give an example from the El Paso shooter where he says, if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. Now, the article notes that environmentalists have definitely tried to distance themselves from these killers and from white nationalists more generally, though the Post does say this: a refrain among environmentalists is that if anti-immigrant groups are genuinely concerned about degradation of the natural world, they're targeting the wrong people. Climate change hasn't been driven by poor people struggling to get by. The activities of wealthy nations have been the main historical source of greenhouse gas emissions, the depletion of natural resources, and the destruction of habitats. Now, I do want to stress that the Post is saying that anti-immigrant groups concerned with degradation of the natural world are targeting the wrong people, not that, as I think it could be easy to read in this article, that anti-immigrant mass murderers are targeting the wrong people. But actually, there's no real logical reason that somebody accepting the environmentalist ideology should not endorse mass shootings so long as they do target the right people. That is, if you have an anti-human goal, like, you've eliminated any rational basis for opposing people who kill humans. And in fact, and I mean this seriously, policies that they advocate are essentially not that different from mass shootings, except that if followed, they would be deadly on a far greater scale.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's a sobering fact, which is who has the lowest carbon footprint in the world? I mean, mass murderers. I mean, they have made up for their footprint many times over, and they're preventing future children from coming into existence. And people can say, well, that's not what I mean by reducing my carbon footprint. But if you have that as an out of context goal, or a primary goal, which is often presented as like, this is really what we should be aspiring to, then it's perfectly logical that people think about. They think these kinds of things are necessary, particularly if they kind of fail politically. They think, well, I'm going to at least do something on my own part. And then the issue of racism is interesting because I regard the whole modern environmental movement as what I would call human racist, and it has a bias, it has an animus against the human race, which it regards as unnatural, and it regards everything else as natural. So it thinks if an activity is done by humans, then it's by that fact bad. Now, if you are a human racist, then how do you distinguish, sort of how do you prioritize which human groups you oppose the most? Well, it makes a lot of sense to oppose them by how good they are or how prolific they are at producing more humans. So in a sense, these are consistent human racists. Now they can say, well, yeah, you should shoot the rich people too, but they're correctly, I think, saying that, well, if you have more kids and then these more kids are going to aspire to have more prosperous lives involving more energy, which is going to mean more fossil fuels, then yeah, it makes sense. So I'm really glad that this angle is being shown, although it's abominable that it hasn't been shown earlier, and that this should just be the mainstream discussion, that we are raising people to be anti-human and to believe that sort of mass human death, or at least a mass sort of mass prevention of human reproduction is morally necessary. Well, if you believe that either mass death or mass prevented reproduction are morally necessary, then these guys are heroes. Stefan, what's your first story?
This is about a recent paper published in Nature Communications. The paper is named Discrepancy in Scientific Authority and Media Visibility of Climate Change Scientists and Contrarians by Peterson et al. And so this has been making the rounds, and it's viewed as sort of a blacklisting of people who don't toe the climate catastrophe line. And so what it essentially does is it compiles two lists of people, one of people who have some media influence and are also speakers at the Heartland Climate Conference, authors of the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change report, also published by the Heartland Institute, and people present on the DeSmog blog, which the authors regard as a long-standing effort to document climate disinformation efforts associated with numerous contrarian institutions and individual actors, but which is really sort of a database of people who are not in line with the catastrophic climate narrative and quite biased in its outlook on that. And so first, the good news is among these alleged contrarians and deniers, as the authors call these people, Alex makes the list in the first third of the list, which is ranked by media influence. So congratulations to Alex for having some influence on the debate. And the second list, they are comparing with the first one, is compiled of scientists who publicize in climate change related fields and are the most highly cited and also have some media visibility. So examples would be Michael Mann and Kevin Trenbers, which are household names to people following the climate debate in the mainstream media. And so they are comparing these two and their visibility, how often they're quoted and invited on media outlets and so on. And so the obvious narrative of this is, okay, so we have one list of people who don't have a lot of scientific credentials, but still have some media influence on the climate debate in the public realm. And then in juxtaposition to this, we have some super top scientists who are cited all the time in scientific papers, and they have a lot of authority, as the authors call this, in the field, but they are not heard remotely enough in comparison to their actual degrees and professional credentials. And so let me just give you a quote from the article. So their conclusion is that indeed communication scholars have noted that in the case of climate change, Such disproportionate visibility or false balancing is likely to mislead public perception, suggesting falsely that within the scientific community there's parity in the number of scientists who do and do not agree on the fundamental issues of anthropogenic climate change. So this is sort of their conclusion or finding, that there's a disproportionate amount of non-catastrophic narrative in the public eye. So this paper, in my professional judgment, is complete junk science, and I'll just give you a couple of points why that is. So first of all, they use vague terminology. So they don't define what a denier or contrarian is. They're sort of using these terms, implying that everyone knows what is meant. So they don't even have a qualitative definition of what would be a position of someone like Alex, who's in the contrarian list, and what is the actual position of someone like Michael Mann on the scientist list. Another thing is that they compare apples to oranges. So they make a list of publishing scientists in a rather obscure field. So this is not something very popular, with people who are media figures often. So this is like apples and oranges, or as Judith Curry, a climate scientist, said, comparing peanuts to elephants. And it's not really making two equal lists and then comparing the media visibility. So obviously, someone like Greta Thunberg would be more visible than Kevin Trenbers, who is a climate scientist. But Greta Thunberg is not on the list of the pro-catastrophe list, because she's not a scientist. So you're comparing two really different categories of people, and obviously the people who are sort of more on the communication side and more on the politics side are more often on media outlets. And they also make some kinds of comparison in the mainstream media, but also in what they call new media, like blogs and podcasts and so on. So this obviously biases the outlook, because people who don't agree with the catastrophic climate narrative often show up on a greater number of podcasts that don't have a lot of reach. They don't have as much reach as CNN or Fox News, but they are counted as media appearances. And then they have a couple of miscounts. So hit job articles are counted as media mentions, which of course is not a good publicity for the people who get hit by these attack articles. And some are misidentified as quote-unquote contrarians when they are actually established scientists and contributors to the IPCC reports. Some examples are Roger Pielke Jr., Roger Pielke Sr., Scott Denning, who's actually an alarmist type, but he ended up on the wrong side by this counting, probably because he spoke at the Heartland Conference against the majority of the people visiting the Heartland Conference. So it's not a really good methodology here. And then they, of course, use a citation metric of the scientists, like how often does your work get cited in other scientific work, which might or might not be a good measurement of the quality of your research. And of course, it's a false dichotomy overall. They say, well, there's one correct side and there's one wrong side, and there's no nuance in, people agreeing with the basic science of the IPCC and then disagreeing with what the policy prescription should be or what the impacts are, and so on and so forth. So overall it's a complete junk science paper to me.
Let me jump in about, you're calling it false dichotomy. So I come at it the climate issue primarily from the perspective of, I have more expertise on energy than I do on climate. And the reason I'm commenting on the issue is because the issue of our influence on the climate is completely inextricably connected to the question of what sources of energy we use to power our civilization, or if we fail to use fossil fuels, it's failing to power our civilization, I believe. So just the whole question of what to do about rising CO2 levels is a completely interdisciplinary question that is hugely an energy question. And so energy is fundamental to our whole standard of living because it's the fuel of all of the machines that allow us to live in this unprecedented way, and also experiencing unprecedented progress, which has really just been 200 years or so that we've had this rate of progress and this progress of human flourishing. So it's just from a human perspective, it's just so obvious that you need to be eminently concerned with all of the questions about how cheap, plentiful, reliable, versatile will energy be in the world. And some of the people on the list are people whose expertise is in energy. And they're saying, yeah, I don't think that the negative side effects of rising CO2 levels are anywhere near as significant as the negative impacts of making energy more expensive, scarce, unreliable, less versatile. So there's just no acknowledgement on this issue that energy is really important and that expertise in energy is very relevant. And I think I would like to see a real study done on the issue of renewable energy and to see how much distortion there is of people who are remotely fact-based versus people who are just making wild speculation. I mean, you would think it would kind of be the equivalent of if you had people just claiming, oh, I've got something better than silicon microchips. And, silicon microchips, that is the core technology for our whole computational system that we have. And so if you just had cranks saying all the time, oh, well, I can do it with this and I can do it with that, and I have some green semiconductor technology, you'd say, well, if you pay too much attention to those people, you're really going to distort the reality, which is that silicon microchips are the foundation of modern computation. And they've given us computation power on a scope and scale that was just completely unimaginable and that's completely unrivaled. And the same is basically true for fossil fuels or hydrocarbon energy. So there's just no, I think not first and foremost for this whole thing, because there are a lot of distortions, but just recognizing that energy is such a value and that expertise in that value is absolutely essential when considering the question of rising CO2 levels. Stefan,
Alex,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I wanted to emphasize, and maybe Stefan, you were planning to get to it, but this is part of the press release. So the context is not that they just have this lousy report, but this is what Professor Peterson says. He says, and again, this is the press release that's going out promoting this article. It's time to stop giving these people visibility, which can be easily spun into false authority. By tracking the digital traces of specific individuals and vast troves of publicly available media data, we develop methods to hold people and media outlets accountable for their roles in the climate change denialism movement, which has given rise to climate change misinformation at scale. This is really an active effort to come up with a list that the media and others should use, not to promote people like you and like the other people on the list.
Yeah, so it's a very direct attack, and you can see with other things we've discussed that there is, among major media outlets, they're trying to develop policies that essentially, they think of it as how do we properly acknowledge the climate crisis or climate emergency, and then really how do we somehow get people to do the right thing from our perspective, which they just keep refusing to do. And so one thing is, The Guardian had it as, we're going to call it climate crisis or climate emergency, but you can see it as, yes, do not allow these people. And if you allow these deniers, these people were on, in a published paper, this was on the deniers list. And then as much authoritarianism as exists in this debate, that can be considered decisive. So it's really an attempt to, it's an attempt to suppress actual discussion. And you can see that in just the sloppiness of it it's very much, we want our clique to be unopposed, not actually we want to help people make certain distinctions, which I could imagine a paper that sort of classified people in a certain way that was useful to people, but this is not that. Stefan, did you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I slightly disagree with the categorization as a blacklist, and many people have called it a blacklisting, but I think like the sloppy nature of how they sorted people into the different buckets, to me doesn't indicate a blacklisting of individuals, like sort of a list of people who shouldn't be invited, but it's more like the establishment of a narrative, like there's a correct narrative and everyone who falls out of this cannot be important enough to show up on media and actually needs to be suppressed. So I don't think it's a targeted list in that sense. But there's also an issue going on with this paper according it's an alleged ethics violation going on, and it might be retracted because of that, because they gathered personal data from the people and publicized it with real names and not anonymizes, and this might be against the law, and I think it's published in the UK. And I wouldn't like to see that, because I think this paper is important. I think it should be accessible to the public with all of its content. And also the reactions by these alleged top scientists and their following should also be on display, because we need to see this for what it is, which is sort of a bullying tactic against people who don't toe the line. And I think the vague language and sloppiness is very intentional, because you don't need to define what the actual correct position is, and you don't need to argue about that. You just say, well, there are legitimate and illegitimate voices, and we decide which one is legitimate. And so this is sort of the method employed here. And I think it should be transparent, it should be widely shared, and people should read it for themselves. It's written in plain English. And it should be in open daylight what's going on here.
Got it. Don, what's your next story?
In a past episode of Power Hour, we talked about how Texas has been shutting down coal plants and replacing them with mostly wind turbines, and that last summer this led to people being quite worried about blackouts. And we also noted that wind apologists dismissed those concerns, and certainly after were quite triumphant about, look, see, there was no problems. Well, early last week, wind power generation in the region plunged for 3 days straight while temperatures hovered around 100, and the electricity grid in Texas was under so much strain that Texas was the single most expensive place to buy power in the United States. Wholesale electric prices, for example, jumped up, this is not a typo, 36,000%, and reached as high as $9,000 a megawatt hour, and averaging over $6,500 a megawatt hour over Texas, with like the lowest price being $250 a megawatt hour. And just to give some context on what those numbers mean, at the same time in surrounding areas, you saw a range from 17 cents a megawatt hour, and I think that was in Louisiana, all the way up to about $61.95, I think, in the Chicago area. And so why were prices going so high? Well, it's because the supply of energy was so constrained in Texas, and that without those high energy prices, Texas would have had to resort to more aggressive energy deprivation measures in order to keep the lights on in Texas. And in fact, they actually did start to resort to some of those measures. So on Tuesday, the grid operator asked customers to voluntarily reduce their use of air conditioning, limit the amount of large appliances they were using, schedule pool pumps to run during off-peak times. And had things gotten any worse, Texas was ready to resort to telling businesses to shut down, which is called industrial demand response, which we've also talked about in the show, and ultimately resort to rotating outages. And so one of the things I want to stress from this story is that it's not like we face a choice between, oh, you have these widespread blackouts that completely bring the state to a standstill or a grid to a standstill, and then everything else is just fine. That in order to avoid widespread blackouts, a grid overloaded with wind and solar, it has to resort to all sorts of painful measures, from high prices to voluntary energy deprivation to industrial energy deprivation to rotating energy outages, in order just to avoid a complete catastrophe. And one of the things I find really troubling is that these stories don't get a lot of attention, because these are warning signals. And it allows wind and solar supporters to go on and say, hey, look, there weren't any widespread blackouts, the system's fine. But actually what we're seeing is that it's becoming super vulnerable, particularly in closed grids like in Texas that can't easily buy electricity from neighbors. And so, I mean, the basic principle is that, just because the patient didn't die doesn't mean that he was healthy.
Well, and we should probably think of what terminology to use, because you mentioned, I think, industrial demand response. There are all these euphemisms that are designed to cover up the truth. I think the term blackout should somehow be used. I mean, it's sort of like an industrial blackout or a targeted blackout or something like that. Yeah, I mean, if you just look at it, if you just even take the last 10 years, certainly the last 20 years, just obviously the capability of producing electricity has dramatically declined. And you think about what a negative achievement that is. I mean, both because electricity is so important, but also just it's not like we've learned less. It's not like we've unlearned how to produce electricity reliably. We know much more. And in fact, we have better ability to produce coal and gas more efficiently. So if anything, we should have higher reliability, lower prices. But because of this insistence on wind, in particular in Texas, we have something that's degrading dramatically in performance. And you're already having these mini blackouts or industrial blackouts. And, you can talk about it as, well, the patient hasn't died. But if you make if you make a person like chronically ill, then it is killing them in a certain way. I mean, everybody your life is measured in time. So you can think of it as, you're losing time in which you can really live. And then I think it's even stronger than that analogy, because what's actually happening is people's productive ability is being throttled. I mean, you can, in a sense, their life ability, if you think about all the role of machines in their lives, but you just think about industrial, and this is their ability to produce different kinds of important goods that people regard as crucial to their lives. And that means that they can't produce as many of them, or that they are going to be more expensive, or in some way they'll end up being lower quality. So you're throttling the productive ability of a whole area of the country, and that's going to have negative consequences throughout. So I'm glad that you are bringing this story to people's attention, and I think that this is something that could be really publicized a lot more, and be good to think about what we can do to publicize it more. Stefan, what's your next story?
I have another story about my home country, Germany. So in Germany, the onshore wind capacity increase has been somewhat stagnating in the first half of 2019. So only 287 megawatts of capacity and a total of 86 new turbines have been added in the first half of the year, which is the lowest level since the year 2000, when the energy transition policy was implemented into law. And so the net capacity after, decreases from decommissioned wind turbines is even lower than that. And so the main reason cited for the sort of decrease in capacity growth has been increasing resistance to new wind projects in the general population, and also increasing regulations like minimum distance setbacks from residential areas. And so I found this interesting because right now we're supposed to be in a time of peak installation of wind and solar capacity. So the government is, having favorable conditions, and guaranteed profits for the renewable energy capacity. And so allegedly wind and solar decrease in price all the time, and that's true for the solar cells and the wind turbines themselves. But as we've discussed in previous power hours, of course, the system cost that these technologies impose on the power grid increase with their share of generation for several reasons, but mainly the intermittency problem. And so we are seeing now a stagnation because of the regulations and the resistance against these projects already at a relatively low share in Germany. So something like 30 to 35% of power generation comes from solar and wind combined now, which is a lot, but it's not even the level of Denmark, which produces over 40% or generates over 40% of its electricity from wind alone. And we already see a stagnation. And this is interesting, in particular because in the near future, people fear a recession or at least a strong economic slowdown in Central Europe and Germany specifically. So the car manufacturers have already built a very low amount of cars, similar to the 2008 financial crisis period. And so I regard this as another sign of the actual failure of energy transition policies. So the power prices, as we've discussed before many times, went up instead of declining when solar and wind were added since 2000, massively so. The emission goals, as timid as they are in Germany right now, will not be achieved, very likely. So this will be all pain, all economic pain, no gain in sort of CO2 emission reductions. And the renewable energy industry, after decades of subsidies and favorable conditions, is unable to grow sufficiently itself without massive government intervention and favors. And so I only see one possible way to achieve these emission reduction goals, and this is curtailing energy demand, which is making Germans poor. So the government has decided we will force these technologies on the population, and they don't work. They don't reduce emissions sufficiently, and they cannot grow exponentially as would be needed to catch up with fossil fuels. And so that's a very, very bad outlook, especially considering that by the end of 2022, the remaining 7 nuclear units will go offline in Germany by law. And solar and wind cannot even close that gap. And then, end of the 2030s, if that will still be the plan by then, and I hope not, the coal capacity will be completely shut down. So I don't see how solar and wind in Germany will even fill the gaps, let alone allow for some energy demand growth there. So this is a real catastrophe for an industrialized country. And again, it's all pain, but no real substantial gain.
So what are you going to do about this? Are you going to flee Germany?
I hope I'm not alone in my fight by then, because so I think the early 2020s will be a crucial political time, I think. So I don't know. Maybe I will run for chancellor, or have my own party running. We'll do something about it. We'll try to fight. And if everything falls apart, then I hope on the other side of the Atlantic you will have your immigration policies updated.
Yeah, we should really, this shouldn't actually be the policy, but I was just thinking, if people wrote a letter, condemning the anti-energy policies of their native country, it should go to the front of the line in terms of you're a real American. I mean, my view about how a lot of this stuff is going to happen is I think that certain countries will be suckers and they'll really hurt themselves. And then at a certain point, the fad will be over. And then other countries won't hurt themselves. And with the U.S., it's scary to think about, because definitely with the There are plenty of problems with the Republicans, so that's no panacea at all. But with the Democrats, I mean, you just have these completely of the ultimate, what I'm calling sucker policies, in terms of just let us outlaw a huge amount of the energy sources that actually are making us prosperous, and then let's just mandate things that don't work at all. And you're seeing, I mean, do much, much more than Germany. So do that many times over and expect a different result. And then so if we do that, then you get a really bad result. And then the question is, and with a lot of those things, you can just undercut yourself hugely in the long term. Now, I think that once enough countries do it, then there will just be and there will be clearly, even more clearly, I think, certain countries who just don't follow these commitments because they're so clearly destructive, and then certain ones that do, and then they're suffering mightily. So I would like to prevent everyone from doing it, but I'm particularly concerned about the U.S. and us being positioned to be the sucker on energy. For many reasons, it's worst from my perspective for us to be the sucker. One is that I'm here, but another is just we're the place with proper mineral rights. So we're a place where you can really innovate in terms of things happening underground. So forbidding, you can imagine like with fracking, forbidding it in France is one thing, but forbidding in the US, that just stops innovation that will ultimately positively affect everyone around the globe. Don, what's your next story?
Axios, the publication that we love to hate, actually has a report acknowledging some of the problems with wind and solar. And so it notes that the costs associated with intermittent wind and solar are growing, and in particular, it's growing as the adoption of wind and solar, from our perspective, slowly grow. And in particular, it's citing a report from Wood Mackenzie. This was part of a report that we talked about a few weeks ago in the show, noting that as wind and solar come to be adopted more on a grid, this not only has certain problems generated by the intermittency, but it has economic problems, major economic problems. And so they quote Robert Whaley from McKinsey saying, not only are renewables causing intermittency issues, they can no longer recover costs in the power market. At the point of 100% saturation, he's referring to the model, not that anybody has actually had 100% saturation or could. He says in their model, at the point of 100% saturation, they're completely dependent on government policy or subsidy. So this is a little bit of a tricky concept to explain, so bear with me, and both of you, I encourage you to step in and clarify any piece of this that you think hasn't come through. But the basic issue here is that you have a bunch of different energy producers selling power to the grid, right? And they're competing to sell power to the grid, and the way that they do that is by having the most low price power. And so what's determining the price that is paid for energy is the lowest cost producer who hasn't yet sold his energy. And that's in economics called the marginal producer. And so everybody's trying to sell their power to the grid, and if they can't sell it, they don't make money. So they're willing to lower the price that they're asking down to their marginal cost. And the problem here is that the marginal costs of wind and solar power, once you set up a wind turbine or a solar panel, is close to zero, which means that as they scale, that is, they can meet more and more of the energy demand whenever they happen to be available, the price energy producers get will basically go to zero. And that's a problem even if you are a wind and solar producer, because even though your marginal costs for producing energy are basically zero, those aren't your only costs. You need to be able to recoup all of your investments and become profitable. And as you are making up more of the energy mix and driving down energy prices, you are putting yourself out of business. And it's even worse than that, because you're also putting out of business all of the reliable energy producers who are necessary, because you can't provide energy all of the time. And so the McKinsey basically says that these markets can handle 40-50% of wind and solar no problem. It's when you get past the 50% mark that it gets trickier and more nuanced. Now, I have skepticism about that. I haven't looked at their model, but it's a question of like, are they referring to an entire grid being 40 or 50% solar or wind? Are they talking about like a subpart that can still trade energy back and forth between other grids? But in any case, like nobody has really reckoned with this economic problem, let alone the more fundamental intermittency problem of wind and solar.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation. I've been thinking lately about these kinds of studies though, because it's so weird in a certain sense. Because you can imagine, somebody like if Wood Mackenzie, not to pick on them, but if they did a study about, I don't know, the phone market or something, and they said, well, you could have just a totally new set of phones made of this kind of material, and it would cost this much, and how could you possibly know that? How could you possibly know when you're dealing with something that just hasn't been done before, and that involves, new, very speculative technologies, which if you're talking about solar and wind actually powering a country versus just being parasites on reliable sources, that is something that's new and unprecedented. Just how do you have any idea what that'll involve, what problems will exist? And just on a common sense level, if we think, the government estimates, how much it's going to cost to put up a new building, or even a private company does, people are often wrong. But then suddenly when we're talking about the whole economy, people will just throw around numbers like, this will cost $40 trillion. And is it worth $40 trillion? And as if versus just having a category of, no, these things are completely, are completely imaginary and uncompetitive, and we have no idea if they will ever be valuable. So there's more to say about that, but that's one thing that strikes me.
I have one complication to add to that story, because I've recently watched a presentation by energy and climate blogger Joe Nova, who had an interesting insight into the Australian energy market or electricity market. And so there it was the case that in these auctions that determine the marginal producer, all of the producers would actually get compensated the final price of the highest bidder. So you get more and more and more megawatt hours of electricity, and the last producer, the highest price producer that bids into the market to fulfill the demand, then determines the compensation for everyone. So if something like a gas peaker plant gets something like the Texas price of $9,000 per megawatt hour, then everyone would get compensated like that. And so everyone in the lower price marginal producer realm, particularly wind and solar, had an interest in destroying all the middle cost coal and gas power plants. Because what would happen is you would get wind and solar as much as possible at marginal production cost of close to zero. And then every one of them would get compensated by, the marginal price of a high price gas peaker plant, right? So they would destroy all of the reliable capacity as sort of in the middle price realm. And that would be very beneficial to them, until, of course, the point where the grid collapses because all of these reliable producers are gone. And I think that's what happens in Australia a lot, where reliable power producers get decommissioned, particularly coal plants, and then you have only some more expensive plants and solar and wind. And once the grid gets stressed, then you don't have a lot of reserve left.
It's related to an interesting feature of modern economic discussion, which is that in energy, at least, there seems to be almost no concern about the issue of competition. Whereas in other industries, you'll see people are concerned about, is there enough competition for X? Is there enough competition for Y? If there's not enough competition, are people, will prices go up? Will people engage in different kinds of conspiracies? And it's very important not to mandate competition, but to have freedom of competition. And one of the things that's important about freedom of competition is that people do have certain kinds of short-term incentives to not be competitive. I mean, they have certain kinds of incentives to conspire with others to drive up prices. So if you think about certain, like there are certain people who own coal plants where they are very eager for other coal plants to shut down, because when there's a crisis, then those coal plants can just print money. And I know people involved in these kinds of transactions. And so from an individual and from a consumer perspective, you really want to make sure that all the different power producers are free to compete. But what you have is this perspective that, well, we collectively should somehow reduce the number of coal plants or reduce whatever else, and then not recognizing that, oh, wait, this is actually a strategy that the remaining plants will love, because and you're showing here they can get paid premium prices that they wouldn't otherwise be able to earn. So I think there should be a lot more concern about real conspiracy among producers to drive up electricity costs, and not just think of it in terms of, well, all coal producers must be allied. In a sense, certain people would, if they could, would be happy to be the only coal producer, or somebody might want to drive coal companies or get utilities out of certain plants. And I know people who get utilities out of certain plants and then they buy the plants. You can just buy really good coal plants at fire sale prices right now. So that's just a really important dynamic of freedom of competition. And particularly when you have the whole utility monopolization of electricity, you need to be even more concerned about that. Okay, Stefan, one more story, but it'll have to be a quick one.
Okay, so this is about planetary protection, or also called contamination fears of the moon. And so back in April of this year, Israeli moon mission Bereshit crash landed on the moon, and in the process it spilled some microbes from Earth. And the microbes in question are tardigrades, which are water-dwelling, half-millimeter sized microbes that feast mostly on plant cells and small invertebrates, and were discovered first in the 18th century. And they are present on all continents of our planet, and they have been carried with that space probe there. And so they're very sturdy. They can survive extreme conditions like short periods of extreme heat, very lengthy periods of extreme cold, the vacuum of space, and so on. So they're very sturdy. They can get into a sort of hibernation state where they release all the body water and then sort of survive as a dry piece of dust, and then can get revived by adding water. And so this raised the question of whether microbes have survived this crash and might now be sort of living in some state on the moon. So, and there were voices of concern that said, okay, international agreements might be violated and so on, but it turns out that these international agreements apply to weapons and other technology, but there are some guidelines that have been established to sort of prevent contamination of other worlds that we might explore. And so you can see this in an analog case in this case of invasive species coming from one continent to the next and wiping out the ecology there. Australia has suffered some of that. And so this might be detrimental to studying other worlds when there's a complex ecosystem present, and we want to study them in sort of their natural state, right? So you can see that there's some concern with that. But I think there's a broader issue of what is present now in our society, and that is the no impact ideal that the Green Movement has established. And so that's seen as it's simply wrong to alter things, and even the moon as an empty, dead desert place should not be contaminated with any microbes. And even people who said, okay, so previous space programs that landed on the moon, or even probes that landed on Mars, contaminated, quote unquote, these celestial bodies. And because that's inevitable. If you're starting a probe into space, some sturdy microbes like this would survive it. And it's very difficult to have zero microbes on your spaceship, right? And so even people who acknowledge this say, well, we should step very cautiously in the future, right? And we are at risk of spilling microbes on empty rocks like the moon. And I think that's a very anti-human view, because ultimately what we want to do is we want to explore space. We want to transform Mars and terraform Mars into a place where humans actually can live long term. That's our nature. We want to explore new things, we want to colonize new things, and we want to change things to make them more habitable for human life. And this inevitably requires massive change, massive impact for the better, and also, quote unquote, contaminating other worlds. And so, as Robert Zubrin, who is a former Power Hour guest and also the president of the Mars Society, said, the goal is, quote, not to stop tardigrades from expanding into space, it is to stop humanity from expanding into space. If sending life to other worlds is defined as, quote unquote, contamination, then humans can't go. And I think this is it. This viewpoint collides with any pro-human ideal, because ultimately humans would be contaminants on other worlds.
Yeah, it's a good kind of controlled experiment of how the viewpoint applies in a situation where it's just you're sort of purely anti-human or pro-human. Now I see I'm looking at your stories, other stories you could have potentially discussed. I see that CNN will host a climate debate, which I hadn't seen. So maybe we'll talk about that this week, or maybe I'll figure out a way to go to that thing and give some opinions, although it's September 4th. They may have speaking around then. But yeah, so thanks, guys, for the good stories today. Listeners, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email them to don@industrialprogress.net. Also, if you are looking for a speaker, or if you're interested in our consulting services on messaging, you can just also email Don with speaking or consulting, don@industrialprogress.net. Make sure to get on the email list, which is alexepsteinlist.com. That's alexepsteinlist.com. Power Hour will be back next week. I may be on it, but I'm at least trying to make every 2 weeks, and I'm hearing some good feedback about the times that I'm not here as well. So glad everyone is enjoying it. Okay, everyone, have a good week, and you'll hear from us soon. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.